that came about was Chad's son Dalton had also stopped his pattern of behavior. So although they didn't necessarily indicate early on they thought he was missing, he was just not, there was no indication that he was actively involved in anything that he had been involved in. So our investigators were concerned not only for Chad's well-being, but for Dalton's. When they executed the search warrant on the property, which is about a 3/4 acre property, as you can see here, with some multiple outbuildings and cars and a lot of items on the big property, we used our tactical operations unit, the SWAT team, to execute the search warrant. Upon execution of the search warrant, they detained 2 people, husband and a wife, who are the residents of the property, and they also located Dalton. Dalton had 3 gunshot wounds, which he indicated had occurred previous month, several weeks before. They were not tended to by any medical professional. He was being kept there, according to his statements, against his will. And any care that he got for those wounds wasn't truly care. I mean, he was suffering from infection and some other issues, and was hospitalized immediately, cared for by our employees, and hospitalized immediately thereafter. A search of the property, investigators recovered several firearms. They recovered illegal substances, and they also recovered 2 deceased bodies. The deceased bodies were unidentified at the time, immediately transported to the medical examiners, not only to determine cause of death, but to identify those individuals. So I'll be preemptive here, because I know for at least some of you, you asked some questions, because I know you like to think you're investigators, but no disrespect intended, that's what we do professionally. You're journalists, and when you ask some of these questions, it's because maybe you just don't have an understanding of what investigations look like. We don't put out information on unknown bodies and unknown cause of death until we know who the person is and what the cause of death is. So yesterday, Mr. Holvig, Chad Holvig, was identified by the medical examiner as one of the deceased bodies. The cause of death is not yet determined. The other victim in that case was identified here as Anthony Vane, a 31-year-old male, died. Cause of death believed to be gunshot wound. So both these bodies were recovered on the property. We have not yet filed charges against anyone regarding the death of Mr. Vane, and we have not yet determined the cause of death, or I should say we, the medical examiner, for Mr. Holvig. So until the cause of death is determined, we're not going to know whether it is a murder or a homicide, because all murders are homicides, but not all homicides are murders. There could be other causes of death. The fact that he was kept there and no one was notified could be a completely different crime if law enforcement wasn't made aware of the circumstances, and we will investigate that further. But right now, both cases of homicide are still under a fluid investigation. There's a considerable amount of evidence that is being processed, both forensic, technology, all types of evidence, to determine what we can regarding the circumstances that occurred leading to the demise of the 2 men. Dalton Holvig, to my knowledge, is still in the hospital recovering. And the charges thus far against the 2, I don't know if they're homeowners, but the 2 on the property. Give me the next slide, please. Roberto Bernal and Christina Bernal were charged. They were booked aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, possession of a weapon by a prohibited possessor, and possession of a weapon by a prohibited possessor for both. So Roberto was charged with the aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and he was a prohibited possessor. Christina was charged with being a prohibited possessor. Just yesterday, the prosecutor added the charges of kidnapping to the suspects. That's what we have at this point. I would tell you that there is a strong possibility that both of these victims were on that property for an extensive period of time. It is extremely difficult to determine time of death when you know that the elements, to include the high temperatures for an extensive period of time, contribute to the decomposition of bodies, of the human body. But there's a high probability that other people were on the property and may have some information regarding who's responsible for these deaths, and if one or both are homicide, and we know that one is if both are homicides. So if someone has information out there that could be helpful to this investigation, you could either contact the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, and we'll make that number available to you, or you can call Silent Witness if you want to remain anonymous. But I will just recap by telling you this is one of those cases where it has multiple working parts. It is exceptional work by all the detectives involved in the investigation, to include the Tactical Operations Unit, that the family played a pivotal part in making sure that their communication with this office emphasized the heightened urgency, so that we acted as quickly as possible to try to locate Mr. Holvig. And all indications are that we know Dalton, I believe his gunshot wound was sustained on the 9th of July. Is that correct? I'll confirm that, but it was several weeks prior. We do not know, we don't have definitive information yet as to when his father was murdered. So there's a lot of things that we're still working through right now to tie up all the loose ends in this investigation, and it is ongoing. But this is an environment, and this is a circumstance where it is indicative of what happens when people utilize drugs and are comfortable with violence and taking lives and then leaving deceased bodies on the property. So I'm happy to answer what questions I can, but understand it's going to be limited. My position is, I'll get to you. My position is, I understand you feel like you have this right to know, but you don't have the right to know right now, because my responsibility first and foremost is to the victims of the case to make sure that we can effectively prosecute and hold accountable those responsible. So with that, fire away.
Where those two bodies were found? We heard it might have been barrels.
Yeah, we don't discuss those circumstances, and the reason that we don't is because at some point in time we'll be interviewing suspects, and there's information that only those responsible would have knowledge of, or those close to the case. So any details that I provide specific to the environment, the crime scene, could undermine our ability to prosecute later on. So I appreciate your question. I'm not going to confirm that, and I'm not going to share any information that is that specific. Thank you.
You said that kidnapping charges were added to the suspects. Is that just for Dalton or for these other two men as well?
Just for Dalton right now. Any potential criminal charges regarding, I apologize, I want to say his first name was Anthony. Until we determine who's responsible, we can't put charges forward until we know the individuals that's responsible for it.
Over there.
So it's a great question. Dalton actually lived there and stayed there for some time, and there's familiarity between the Bernals and him. And then Chad had just recently, according to the family, gone there to either just visit or stay for some time to go see Dalton. So Dalton's time there was a longer time frame. Chad's was just from the point when he went missing, but it wasn't an unfamiliar location. Everybody that was on the property had a relationship to some extent.
Anthony, too.
Anthony is the one that we're still trying to better understand the timeline and his relationship with them. He, when we look at the dynamic of the family being the Holvig family and then the Bernals, that relationship we understand pretty clearly. What we don't understand is what Anthony's relationship was with anybody on the property yet.
How would you describe that relationship between the Bernal and the Holvig family?
Well, just that they didn't know each other. They, again, they were occupants on the property, staying on the property. So we know that they had a purpose and they had a relationship to be there. Anthony, we don't know. I mean, obviously they could have had some form of relationship. We just don't know why he was on the property. We have no idea to be able to determine time of death, so how long he was there.
Can you give any update on the condition of Chad Holvig when you figured out when you saw the body? I mean, like when you were able to identify him? I mean, what was his like? Was there any like wounds, or can you describe the body at all?
Oh no, his wounds were substantial. He had gotten no care whatsoever. They were gunshot wounds to his lower extremities. So investigators described it as it was infected, and it was, apparent to them that he was suffering. His consciousness, I guess, could have been also impaired to some extent due to substances, and we're not clear on what or how or who was giving him those substances, whether it was some form of what they thought was medical treatment, or if it was a contributor to the fact that he was being held against his will.
And that was Chad or Dalton?
That is Dalton.
Okay.
Yeah, Dalton is the one who had the gunshot wounds and is in the hospital recovering.
In terms of Chad, can you talk about what condition he was found in? Or I know you said there's no cause of death right now, but any kind of wounds?
Yeah, we'll wait until the medical examiner actually gives us a full report on once they determine cause of death. Decomposing dead body. I mean, that sounds really cold and graphic. I don't mean for it to, but until we know more about it, it is a man who was found dead, and his body had been there for some period of time in the conditions outside, which in Arizona is hot. So decomposition happens pretty quickly.
You mentioned illegal substances were also found on the property. Is anyone facing charges for those?
Those are still pending. We're waiting for a chemical analysis back from the lab. So once we get those and able to determine if we can tie those substances specifically to an individual. And I think a part of it's going to be, as Dalton recovers, what are we able to ascertain from his statements and be able to then substantiate through evidence that we find on scene. And again, I call out to the community every time we have a situation, just because we have folks in custody and we may have suspects or investigative leads. It is a puzzle of information, and there are people out there right now that know exactly what happened or could know, what happened. And if you'll call in and help us solve this, go a long way with this community and with the family.
Would you say that Anthony and Chad's bodies were in similar types of conditions, or was one like markedly different than the other?
I don't know. I wouldn't know how to properly answer that and keep it within the framework, as I said, where I don't want, when investigators interview potential suspects, we know that they're going to know details that others don't. So anything that I share could undermine the hard work by investigators, and my job is to protect the integrity of it. So I appreciate your question, but I'm just not willing to answer that.
Just so I have the timeline correct, family reported that they were concerned about Chad on July 11th. But then within that time frame, between that and the search warrant being served, they also became concerned about Dalton.
Yeah, they expressed, I think, that our investigators working alongside the family, because so what you do is you're identifying a pattern of behavioral practice, a pattern of life, right? So how, if you go to the ATM, if you use your phone, if you check in with whomever, if all of a sudden those things come to a hard stop, then we know that there's a heightened concern. Dalton maybe had not been as actively engaged with his family as Chad was. So initially it's just like, okay, Dalton doesn't check in as much. But as we're going through it and we start taking a look at that also, because we're looking for Chad and Dalton, we know where he is, and also we realize Dalton's activity had diminished dramatically also. And that's what led us to, and the family, to be more concerned for him also. But the search warrant was executed on that property with intentions believing that we would see Chad there or find information leading us to Chad. And unfortunately, the circumstances were dire.
Of motive other than you said that you referenced drug and relations to drugs and violence?
So, well, you have different, even though they may be intertwined, you have the motive behind why was Dalton assaulted with a firearm, and then you have the motive behind who's responsible for Chad's murder. And what normally happens is you need to know who before you'll know why. That is a great contributor. So we know who's responsible for shooting Dalton, but we don't know all the motivations behind it yet. We'll work through that until we can really pinpoint who's responsible for how Chad died, and if someone was it was at someone's hands, then we can determine motive better. But right now, those are unanswered questions.
You said you thought people had visited the property.
That's a speculation. There's no evidence to say folks did, but just with this lengthy time frame, we know that the front of the house, that there was kind of a tattoo shop, that Roberto was, I guess, a tattoo artist, so I don't know if anyone received tattoos in that time frame. I don't know who came or went, but it's a long time. I mean, for someone to have no visitors in that lengthy period of time would be unlikely. So they may know something, they may not, but I'm just calling out to the community to help us if you do.
Criminal history at all for the Bernals?
Everyone had a criminal history with the exception of Chad.
Anything of note?
I don't know what would be noteworthy, but we'd be happy to get you that information. You can determine if it's noteworthy or not.
Just to clarify, I know, because you had said at the beginning, not, all homicides or murders, et cetera. Do you believe Chad was murdered then?
I don't have an opinion of it. Anytime you have an environment where there are drugs and there are bad actors and this type of potential violence, the cause of death, could be anywhere on the spectrum. The idea that Dalton was shot 3 times obviously heightens our concern for how his father, what contributed to his demise. But I just don't want to be premature in assuming anything.
So you know who's responsible for shooting Dalton?
Correct. Roberto was charged with shooting Dalton. That's the aggravated assault charges.
So Dalton was reported missing on July 10th, and it was known that the father had gone down to go visit him. Did the family ever go to the home of Dalton to check up on either or? by any chance?
July 11th is what I have, unless I'm incorrect. I don't know if the family went there or not. The investigators would know. That's just not a question I asked, but we can get that answer for you. I would tell you that I just want to make sure that I express my concern for first of all, my condolences to the family, but secondly, my concern for their safety, because until, we put a bow on this and know who's responsible, I think anyone that is in the family could have some concern for their own safety, not knowing what the contributors were as to why Dalton was assaulted and if someone's responsible for Chad's death. Well, until we charge somebody with it, I'm concerned. Until we know unequivocally that everybody that's a participant in the death, again, of Anthony, I'm always concerned, but I'm concerned every day of the week because unfortunately we were in the business of trying to stop violence and hold people accountable. So, yeah, concerned.
Like I said, are you looking for anyone else out there right now?
I'm looking for whoever's responsible, and whether that's one, two, or more, we just want to wrap the entire group up. So until the evidence provides us facts to definitively say how many people were involved, we will go about it not knowing that answer until they're in custody.
Should the community then be concerned?
As I said, I'm in the business of law enforcement. I see far too many cases when we're talking about. There's a lot that we don't. So if the question is, are we concerned that there's a murder at large that could potentially harm others, I think that this incident here will play itself out in a way that there was a relationship between the person responsible for the murder and the victim. So anybody outside of that realm should just have the level of concern they do just in their everyday life, as it pertains to potential crime or being a victim.
Just to clarify, have you spoken with Dalton? Like, I know you said he was in the hospital still. Like, have you followed up with him at all yet?
Investigators have, but when I say that, I say it from my perspective as being the sheriff, understanding what the investigators are trying to accomplish. So you have a person who allegedly has been held against his will for a lengthy period of time. He's got substantial injuries that he's recovering from. His state of mind as well as his health, and depending on how they were caring for him, are going to impair him mentally and physically. So I would just think that you'll get statements initially that are helpful, and over time maybe he recalls more or he clarifies things as he gets stronger and he gets healthier. So it'll be an ongoing fluid process, and it's possible that we may get clarification suddenly because he has an epiphany or he's more clear of mind. Anything else on this one? All right, let's move on again. Just because I'm here, I'm not going to make a habit of suddenly coming in front of you guys and trying to do your job and being like a news reporter. Let's cover weather, sports, and everything else, but we got a few more topics, so let me see what we got. Go ahead, Jay. There we go. This is already, I guess, touched on by the FBI, but I just like giving accolades to our FATE team. They got information regarding a bank robber out of St. Louis from 2017, and within, I think it was 24 hours from receiving the information, they went on the hunt with the FBI task force and apprehended this bank robber who will be extradited back to St. Louis for his crime. So, we talk about those who are a threat to our community. The FATE team continues to do exceptional work, focusing on the most dangerous in our community and being very good at what they do and wrapping up bad guys. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that one because we're well over 900 arrests now. And then the other one is actually a really good project that we're working on. So the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research gave us a $500,000 grant to support efforts and activities to reduce human trafficking, which for everyone in our community should be top of mind, whether you think you're affected by it or not. Just the idea that human beings can be treated as property and trafficked in some way, and sex trafficking is another element of that threat to the quality of life and just respect for human life. So we're making a very concerted effort to focus on that, and that money will go towards a lot of different things in partnership with ASU, to include funding a facility, 3 years. We'll have funding for 3 years of a conference, training for. Stay where you're bouncing back and forth. Let me go. There we go. Classifications on human trafficking identification prevention, electronic screening tool for inmate tablets. So when we have women in custody, primarily women, but it could be men, and sometimes they're not even aware of the circumstances that it was human trafficking, we have educational pieces on there as well as resources that they can reach out to get help. So the tablet will incorporate more sophisticated information, more depth of information, staffing and equipment for MCSO, for our heat detectives, also for human exploitation, and then an East Valley location designed specifically for a more victim-friendly environment. So what does that mean? We don't want people coming into an environment and feeling as though they're in a law enforcement community. We want them a sense of peace, of comfort, of serenity, and of safety, and that goes a long way in helping them to address their stress, their PTSD, their fears, all those types of things. So we're working very hard to become one of the best organizations in the nation, law enforcement organizations focusing on human trafficking. It is very close to my heart as a priority. I think we can learn to treat each other better with respect for everyone's place and space in human life, that we'll all be better off. And quite frankly, when women are affected, moms are the most powerful force in nature. And when they can be healthy and care for their children, then their children are raised in a space that they have self-esteem and are productive and live a better life. So let's start taking care of the women in our community and stop victimizing them, and the world becomes a better place. So that's a big part of this project. Any questions I can answer? I don't think that was on the agenda today, unrelated questions.
So a question on Jonathan Rounds. He was an inmate supposed to be transported, but was tased and then taken to the hospital back on July 5th. Just wondering if there are any internal affairs investigations. I think the last update that we had from your office is the Professional Standards Bureau was investigating, so wondering if anyone's been placed on administrative.
I think that's the one, unless I'm wrong, and I apologize because the names sometimes are more than I can gather, but I think that's the one that I turned over to the Department of Public Safety to make sure that they were investigating the criminal side. And there's always a parallel professional standards investigation. No one's on leave right now. There's no indication to show that any actions by the officers were malice or violent, that it was unfortunate circumstances, and we have to wait to find out what DPS determines as well as the medical examiner. But the investigation internally will always take place in every case like that, so it's ongoing. And if I deem that there is a reason to be concerned that one of our employees is behaving in a way that's a threat to our community, then I'll put them on administrative leave immediately, but that's not the case in this situation, at least not anything I've seen yet.
The last update that we had was that he was still in the hospital. Has he died?
I don't know his status, but Joaquin will get you an update on that. I apologize. And I get one compliment all the time. I may get other compliments that's uncommon, but the one I get is, "Hey, Sheriff, thanks for not being on the news." And I tell people, "You're welcome," because I like not being on the news. So although I've been on the news twice in the past maybe 2 weeks, I don't want to make this a regular habit of being in front of you and giving you reports unless it's necessary. But when you know that I'm going to be in front of you, if you have questions about other cases, don't hesitate to send that to my PIOs so that I can get you the information up front. And I know it's on short notice, so please don't think it's a criticism. But don't feel like you can't tell me what you need in advance. This way either I can get it for you or my PIOs will while you have my time. But it's just a little harder if I don't know what's coming. All right? Thank you.